The sun hadn't yet climbed high enough to burn off the thin veil of mist that clung to the rolling hills of Pine Crest, a sleepy little town where time seemed to move slower, softer, like the rustle of autumn leaves underfoot. For Lena Morgan, mornings were a quiet ritual, a sacred rhythm she'd carved out in the stillness of her small, weathered house on the edge of town. The clock struck 6:30, its faint chime cutting through the silence, and she stirred awake, her breath fogging slightly in the cool air of their modest bedroom. Beside her, tucked beneath a faded quilt, her 3-year-old son, Emer, lay sleeping, his small chest rising and falling with a peace she envied. His face, framed by a mop of dark curls, was serene. Too serene, perhaps, for a child his age. Emer didn't babble or laugh or call her mama like other children did. He was silent, a mystery wrapped in a little boy's body, his voice locked away behind a wall no doctor could fully explain. Lena slipped out of bed, her bare feet brushing the cold hardwood floor, and padded to the kitchen. The familiar creak of the boards beneath her was a comfort, a reminder that this was home, their sanctuary in a world that often felt too big, too loud for her quiet son. She set the kettle on the stove, its low whistle soon filling the room as she prepared breakfast. Oatmeal with a drizzle of honey for Emer, a slice of toast for herself. Her hands moved with practiced ease, but her mind lingered on him, always on him. Emer's silence wasn't just an absence of words. It was a weight she carried in her chest, a longing to hear his voice, to know the thoughts swirling behind those remarkable eyes, one blue as a summer sky, the other amber like the glow of a harvest moon. She'd spent countless nights wondering what he saw when he gazed out at the world, what stories he told himself in that unspoken language of his. By the time she returned to his room, he was awake, sitting up in bed with his stuffed elephant clutched tight. His mismatched eyes lit up when he saw her, a flicker of joy that never failed to melt her heart. "Good morning, my little explorer," she whispered, kneeling to pull him into a hug. He didn't answer, of course, but his hands flapped excitedly against her shoulders, a silent yes, a burst of feeling he couldn't voice. She dressed him in his favorite blue jacket, zipping it up with care, then packed a small bag with snacks, apple slices, a handful of crackers, knowing their morning walk was the one thing that truly brought him alive. In a town like Pine Crest, where everyone knew your name and children roamed free without fear, these walks were their tether, a thread of connection between a mother who spoke and a son who didn't. As they stepped outside, the crisp autumn air kissed their cheeks, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. Leaves crunched beneath their boots, a golden carpet stretching toward the trail they loved. A winding path just 5 minutes from home, curving through meadows and into the old forest the locals simply called the woods. Lena took Emer's small hand in hers, feeling the warmth of his fingers against her palm, and smiled down at him. "Ready for our adventure?" she asked, her voice soft with hope. He squeezed her hand, his eyes gleaming with that quiet intensity she'd come to know so well. And she felt it again, that ache, that fierce, tender love for this boy who spoke with his soul instead of his words. This was Pine Crest, their haven, where the biggest dramas were deer in someone's garden or the annual fall festival. But today, as they walked toward the trail, Lena couldn't shake a strange feeling, a whisper of something shifting beneath the ordinary. She didn't know it yet, but this morning, simple, routine, bathed in the golden light of an autumn dawn, would be the last of its kind. Beyond the hills, beyond the trees, fate was waiting, muddy and broken, ready to unravel their lives in ways she could never have imagined. For now, though, it was just her and Emer, hand in hand, stepping into the day with no idea of the miracle and the danger that lay ahead. The trail stretched out before Lena and Emer like an old friend, its curves and dips as familiar as the lines on her own hands. The morning air was sharp with the tang of fallen leaves, and each step they took sent a satisfying crunch echoing through the stillness of Pine Crest's outskirts. Lena held Emer's small hand tightly, his fingers curling into hers with a trust that made her heart ache. She'd walked this path 100 times, maybe more, since he was a baby strapped to her chest, his tiny head bobbing against her heartbeat. Back then, she'd whispered stories to him about the squirrels darting through the underbrush, or the birds flitting between branches, hoping one day he'd echo her words back. That hope had faded over the years, replaced by a quieter acceptance, but it never fully died. Not with Emer. Not with those eyes, one blue, one amber, that seemed to hold entire worlds she couldn't reach. Today, the meadow bloomed stubbornly despite the cooling season, wildflowers nodding in the breeze like defiant little flames against the graying sky. Lena pointed them out to Emer, her voice soft and lilting. "Look at those, sweetheart. Still hanging on, even with winter creeping in." He didn't respond, not with words, but his head tilted slightly, his gaze following her finger. That was enough. It always had to be enough. She watched him stoop to pick a dandelion, its fragile seeds trembling in his grasp, and offer it to her with a solemnity that twisted something deep inside her chest. She took it, tucking it behind her ear, and smiled. "Thank you, my little explorer. It's perfect." His dimples flashed briefly, a rare gift, and for a moment, the silence between them felt less like a wall and more like a bridge. Their boots, waterproof, practical, a necessity after recent rains, squelched faintly against the muddy patches of the trail. Lena had dressed them both for the mess, knowing how the earth clung to everything this time of year. She glanced up at the sky, where gray clouds gathered like a promise of rain, their edges tinged with a heaviness she could almost feel. "Looks like we'll keep it short today, huh?" she said, squeezing Emer's hand. He nodded, a small, deliberate motion, and her heart swelled at how attuned he was to her, even without words. This was their dance, her voice, his gestures, a rhythm they'd perfected in the absence of speech. The trail wound past the meadow and toward the old forest, its towering pines casting long shadows that swallowed the light. Lena loved this part, the way the world hushed as they stepped beneath the canopy, the air growing cooler, thicker with the scent of resin and earth. Emer's eyes widened, drinking in every detail, a flicker of wings overhead, a rustle in the bushes, the glint of sunlight piercing through the leaves. He didn't point or ask why, like other children might, but she could see the curiosity burning in him, alive and fierce behind his silence. It was in these moments, surrounded by nature's quiet symphony, that she felt closest to him, as if the forest itself spoke the language he couldn't. She adjusted the strap of her backpack, the weight of snacks and a water bottle a comforting anchor. This walk was more than routine. It was Emer's joy. The one time his guarded little world seemed to open, if only a crack. Lena didn't know what it was about the trail that lit him up. Maybe the freedom, maybe the sounds, but she'd never let a day pass without giving him this. Not when she saw how his shoulders relaxed, how his hands stopped fidgeting, how he seemed, for a fleeting hour, to belong wholly to the moment. As they neared the fork where the path split, one way to the open meadow, the other into the denser woods, Lena felt a tug at her sleeve. Emer's eyes locked on hers, bright with something she couldn't name, and she paused. The air shifted, a whisper of wind stirring the leaves above, and she wondered if he felt it too, that faint, unspoken pull toward something waiting beyond the trees. For now, though, it was just the two of them, mother and son, bound by love and silence, stepping into a morning that shimmered with the promise of the ordinary until it wouldn't. The fork in the trail loomed ahead, a quiet crossroads where the path split like a river diverging into two uncertain streams. To the left, the meadow stretched wide and open, its golden grasses swaying under the weight of gathering clouds, a safe, familiar choice. To the right, the woods beckoned, their dense canopy of gold and red swallowing the light, whispering secrets in the rustle of leaves. Lena paused, her boots sinking slightly into the damp earth, and glanced down at Emer. His small hand rested in hers, warm and steady, but his gaze was fixed on the shadowed path to the right. She felt the pull in his grip, subtle yet insistent, like a tide tugging at the shore. "Meadow today, right, buddy?" she said, her voice gentle but edged with practicality. The sky above was darkening, the air growing heavy with the promise of rain, and she knew the open path would be kinder if the weather turned. She tugged his hand lightly, an invitation to follow her lead, but Emer didn't budge. His feet planted themselves firm, his mismatched eyes, one blue as a storm, one amber as a flame, locked on the woods with a fierceness she rarely saw. He pointed, his small finger trembling with purpose, and her heart stuttered. This wasn't his usual quiet curiosity. This was something deeper, something alive and urgent pulsing through him. "You want to go that way?" she asked, kneeling to meet his gaze. His nod came swift and sure, no hesitation, no flicker of doubt. Those eyes, so full of stories she couldn't decipher, pleaded with her in a language beyond words. Lena hesitated, her practical side warring with the trust she'd always placed in her son's instincts. The woods were his favorite, she knew that. Their cathedral of leaves and shadows transformed every walk into an adventure, a place where he seemed to breathe freer, unburdened by the silence that cloaked him. But today felt different. The air pressed against her skin, thick with an unspoken warning, and she glanced at her watch. They had time, didn't they? Just a short detour before the rain came. "Okay," she relented, her voice softening with a smile. "Just for a little bit, then." Emer's dimples flashed, a rare spark of joy that lit up his face, and he squeezed her hand as if to say thank you. She stood, brushing a curl from his forehead, and let him lead her toward the woods. The trail narrowed as they crossed the threshold, the world shifting around them. The bird calls faded, replaced by the hush of wind through branches and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. The light dimmed, filtered through a tapestry of leaves that glowed like stained glass, and Lena felt the familiar thrill of stepping into Emer's world, a place where silence wasn't empty, but full of meaning she ached to understand. He walked with purpose now, his usual meandering replaced by a steady stride that surprised her. She'd seen him stop a dozen times on this path before, crouching to study a rock or trace a stick through the dirt, but not today. Today, he moved like he knew something she didn't, like the woods were calling him forward with a voice only he could hear. Her chest tightened with a mix of pride and unease. What was it about this moment, this boy, that felt so fragile, so precious? She wanted to scoop him up, hold him close against whatever lay ahead, but she let him go, trusting the pull of his small, determined hand. The trees closed in around them, their branches weaving a roof that shut out the sky. Lena breathed in the scent of pine and moss, feeling the dampness of the earth seep through her boots. She didn't know it yet, but this choice, yielding to Emer's silent will, would unravel the thread of their ordinary lives. Somewhere beyond the next bend, hidden in the mud and shadows, a broken creature waited, its fate entwined with theirs. For now, though, it was just a mother and her son, stepping deeper into the woods, chasing a mystery neither could name, bound by a love that needed no words. The woods wrapped around Lena and Emer like a living thing, their shadows deepening as the trail twisted through the trees. The air grew heavier, laced with the earthy scent of moss and the faint metallic tang of rain on the horizon. Lena's boots sank into the softening ground, each step a quiet squelch that echoed in the stillness. Emer led the way, his small figure a beacon in his blue jacket, his hand tugging hers with a determination she couldn't ignore. She'd meant to keep this detour short, but time slipped away beneath the canopy, the world outside fading until it was just the two of them, bound by the rhythm of their breaths and the crunch of leaves. They'd gone deeper than she'd planned when Lena paused, fishing her phone from her pocket to check a message from work. A quick distraction, a tether to the life beyond these woods. Her thumbs tapped out a reply, her focus narrowing to the screen's glow. "Just a second, baby," she murmured, her voice swallowed by the rustling branches. She didn't notice Emer's hand slip from hers, didn't hear the soft shuffle of his boots as he veered off the path. The message sent with a faint ping, and she looked up, expecting to see him beside her, his mismatched eyes gleaming with quiet wonder. But he was gone. "Emer?" Her voice cracked the silence, sharp and sudden. Her heart lurched, a cold fist tightening in her chest as she spun in a circle, scanning the trees. The woods stared back, indifferent, their shadows pooling like ink. "Emer!" Louder now, her call trembled with rising panic. He couldn't have gone far, not in mere seconds, but the forest felt vast, a maze of bark and branches that could swallow a child whole. She took a few quick steps down the path, her breath hitching, fighting the dread clawing up her throat. Then, through a tangle of bare limbs 20 feet ahead, she glimpsed a flash of blue, his jacket. Relief flooded her, hot and dizzying, only to twist into frustration as she pushed through the undergrowth. "Emer Morgan, you know better than to walk away from Mommy," she called, her voice shaking with the aftershock of fear. The ground grew softer beneath her boots, mud sucking at her soles as she neared him. He stood motionless, his back to her, a small silhouette against the gray light filtering through the trees. "You scared me, baby," she began, reaching for his shoulder. "You can't just—" The words died in her throat, choked off by the sight that stole her breath. There, half submerged in a thick, dark pool of mud, lay a creature so broken it barely seemed alive. A German shepherd, its once proud coat matted with filth and crusted blood, sprawled helplessly in the mire. One leg twisted at a grotesque angle, barbed wire coiled cruelly around its body, cutting into flesh that was little more than skin stretched over bone. Its ribs heaved with shallow, ragged breaths, and a faint, pitiful whine escaped its muzzle. A sound so weak it was a miracle Emer had heard it at all. Lena's first thought was that it was dead, a casualty of the wild, until those shallow gasps proved otherwise. Her stomach churned, a mix of horror and pity knotting inside her. "Oh my God," she whispered, instinctively pulling Emer back. "Don't touch it, sweetie. It could be dangerous." But Emer twisted free, dropping to his knees beside the dog before she could stop him. His small hand reached out, trembling but unafraid, and brushed the matted fur on its head. The dog's eyes fluttered open, amber, like Emer's own, and filled with a pain so raw it pierced Lena's heart. Yet there was no growl, no snap of teeth, only a quiet resignation that was somehow worse. It had given up, abandoned to die in this cold, lonely place. Lena sank to her knees beside her son, her arm curling protectively around him. "How did you hear it?" she breathed, more to herself than to him. Emer's face twisted with distress, his eyes locked on the dog, and in that moment she saw something shift in him, a spark of connection, a silent vow. The woods held their breath, and Lena knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that their lives had just collided with something far bigger than this muddy clearing. The clearing seemed to shrink around Lena, the trees pressing in as if to bear witness to the fragile tableau before her. Her silent son, his small hand resting on the mud-caked head of a dying dog, and the weight of a choice she hadn't asked for. The German shepherd's amber eyes, mirrors to Emer's own, stared up at them, clouded with pain yet piercingly alive. A flicker of something. Hope, perhaps, buried beneath the exhaustion. Its whine, faint as a thread, wove through the rustling leaves, tugging at Lena's heart like a plea she couldn't ignore. She knelt beside Emer, her knees sinking into the cold, wet earth, her breath catching as she took in the full scope of the animal's suffering. Barbed wire bit into its flesh, its broken leg hung useless, and its ribs jutted out like the bars of a cage beneath its matted fur. This wasn't just a stray. It was a creature abandoned, left to fade into the mud. "Don't touch it, sweetie," she repeated, her voice trembling with a mother's instinct to shield her child. "It could be dangerous." But Emer didn't pull back. His fingers lingered on the dog's head, gentle and unafraid, as if he could feel the pulse of its fading life beneath the filth. The dog didn't flinch or bare its teeth. Instead, its eyes softened, a quiet surrender that broke something inside Lena. She'd always been wary of strange dogs, big ones especially, memories of childhood warnings flashing through her mind. Yet here, in this moment, fear gave way to a tide of compassion she couldn't stem. How long had it been trapped here? Alone, starving, its strength bleeding out into the mire. What kind of cruelty had brought it to this? Emer turned to her, his mismatched eyes wide with an urgency she'd never seen before. His hands moved, frantic little scoops at the mud, as if he could dig the dog free with his bare fingers. "You want to help it?" she whispered, her voice soft with uncertainty. He nodded, fierce and resolute, and her throat tightened. This was her son, her silent, guarded boy, showing more emotion in this muddy hollow than she'd seen in months, maybe years. She couldn't turn away from that, not when his heart was reaching out in a way his voice never could. Lena pulled her phone from her pocket, fumbling with chilled fingers, only to see the dreaded words, "No service." Her stomach sank. They were alone out here, miles from help, with rain clouds thickening overhead and the first faint drops beginning to fall. She looked back at the dog, its shallow breaths barely lifting its chest, and felt the weight of its life pressing against her. They couldn't leave it. Not like this. Not when Emer's eyes begged her to act. "Okay," she said, more to herself than to him, a decision settling into her bones. "We're going to help you." She reached out, her hand hovering over the dog's head, half expecting a snap or a growl. But when her fingers brushed its fur, it only closed its eyes, a shudder running through its frail body as if her touch was both agony and solace. "It's okay," she murmured, tears pricking her own eyes. "We're here now." The rain began to fall in earnest, cold droplets splashing against her skin, washing streaks of mud from the dog's coat and revealing more of the horror beneath, dried blood, deep cuts, a story of suffering etched into its flesh. Lena's heart ached with a fury she didn't know she could feel, not just for the dog, but for the boy beside her, whose small hands mirrored hers, scooping at the mud with a desperation that mirrored her own. This wasn't just a rescue. It was a pact, forged in the wet, unforgiving earth. Lena didn't know how they'd save this broken creature or what it would cost them. But as she looked into Emer's eyes, blue and amber, fierce with purpose, she knew they'd fight for it together. The woods stood silent around them, witnesses to a mother's love and a child's courage, as the first threads of an unbreakable bond began to weave through the rain. The rain fell harder now, a relentless curtain of cold that plastered Lena's hair to her forehead and seeped through her jacket, chilling her to the bone. She knelt in the mud beside the German shepherd, her hands trembling not just from the cold but from the weight of what lay before her. The dog's amber eyes followed her every move, dulled by pain yet clinging to a fragile trust that pierced her heart. Barbed wire twisted cruelly around its body, a jagged snare that had bitten deep into its flesh, leaving trails of dried blood and raw, oozing wounds. Each shallow breath it took seemed a miracle, a defiance against the death that loomed so close. Lena's stomach churned with a mix of horror and helpless rage. Who could do this to a living creature, abandon it to such a slow, merciless end? Emer crouched beside her, his small hands scooping at the mud with a frantic energy she'd never seen in him before. His blue jacket was streaked with filth, his curls dripping wet, but his focus never wavered from the dog. "Wait, baby," she said, her voice thick with emotion as she gently pulled his hands back. "If we do this wrong, we could hurt it more." He looked up at her, his mismatched eyes, blue and amber, brimming with a distress that mirrored her own, and she felt her resolve harden. They couldn't stop now, not when he'd found this broken soul, not when he cared so fiercely in his silent way. Lena turned back to the dog, her breath catching as she assessed the tangle of wire. It wasn't just wrapped around its midsection. It coiled around its back leg, too, the barbs embedded so deep she couldn't tell where metal ended and flesh began. "Oh, you poor thing," she whispered, her fingers hovering over its matted fur. "What happened to you?" The dog whimpered softly, a sound so faint it nearly drowned in the rain, and she felt tears sting her eyes. She couldn't cut the wire. Her hands were empty of tools, their walk meant to be simple, safe. But she couldn't leave it like this either. Her gaze darted around the clearing, landing on a broken branch nearby, its jagged end glinting in the dim light. It wasn't much, but it might work. She stretched for it, mud sucking at her boots, and tested its strength in her hands. "Stay back a little, Emer," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. "I need to see how stuck it is." He obeyed, scooting closer to the dog's head, his small hand resting gently on its ear, the one part of it that seemed untouched by the nightmare. Lena began to work, her movements slow and deliberate, using the branch to pry at the wire where she could, digging away mud with her numb fingers where she couldn't. The rain washed some of the filth from the dog's coat, revealing more of its emaciated frame, its ribs stark against its skin. How had it survived this long, trapped and starving, with no one to hear its cries? Minutes stretched into an eternity, the cold seeping deeper into her bones as she fought the wire's cruel grip. Emer watched, his eyes never leaving the dog, and then, softly, almost too quiet to hear, he began to hum. It was a sound Lena had never heard from him before, a low, soothing vibration that seemed to weave through the rain. The dog's tail twitched, a feeble attempt at a wag, and Lena's breath caught. "You're helping, buddy," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You're keeping it calm." Finally, after what felt like hours, she loosened a section of wire around the dog's back leg. It winced, a soft cry escaping, but didn't pull away. "Just a little more," she encouraged, unsure if she was speaking to the dog, to Emer, or to herself. With a final careful tug, she freed the last barb from its midsection, the metal clattering to the ground. She sat back on her heels, breathless, her hands smeared with mud and blood, and looked at the dog, still trapped in the bog but unshackled from its torment. Emer reached out, stroking its head, and Lena knew this was only the beginning. They'd freed it from the wire, but its life still hung by a thread, and somehow so did theirs. The rain pounded down in relentless sheets, turning the clearing into a sodden battlefield of mud and despair. Lena's hands, raw and numb from wrestling with the barbed wire, hovered over the German shepherd, its frail body now free of the cruel metal but still ensnared by the thick, sucking mire. The dog's amber eyes flickered with a dim light, a spark of life that refused to gutter out despite the odds. Its breaths came in shallow gasps, each one a fragile thread tethering it to the world, and Lena felt that thread pulling at her own heart. She couldn't look away from the hollows of its ribs, the way its once majestic coat clung to its bones like a shroud. This wasn't just an animal. It was a survivor, a soul that had endured unimaginable torment, and now it lay at her mercy. Emer knelt beside the dog, his small hands streaked with mud, his blue jacket soaked through. His mismatched eyes, one blue, one amber, mirrored the dog's own, locked on it with a quiet intensity that broke Lena's heart. He'd stopped humming, but his presence was a steady anchor, a silent promise that they wouldn't abandon this creature to the cold. "We've got the wire off," Lena said, her voice hoarse with exhaustion. "But now we need to get you out of this mud." The words felt hollow. How could they? The dog was too weak to stand, its broken leg dangling uselessly, and the bog gripped it like quicksand, reluctant to release its prey. She scanned the clearing, desperation clawing at her chest until her gaze fell on her jacket, still draped over a nearby log where she'd left it to work. "This might work," she muttered, scrambling to grab it. The fabric was damp but sturdy, and she laid it beside the dog, her mind racing. "If we can get you onto this, maybe we can pull you out." She looked at Emer, his small face solemn with determination. "Can you hold the bottom part, buddy? We'll slide it out together." He nodded, gripping the hem of the jacket with both hands, his tiny fingers curling tight as if he understood the stakes. Lena positioned herself beside the dog, her boots sinking deeper into the muck. "It's okay," she whispered, her voice trembling as she slid her arms beneath its frail frame. "We've got you." The dog whimpered, a soft, pained sound that cut through her, but it didn't resist. With all her strength, she rolled it onto the jacket, its body limp yet heavier than she'd expected, a testament to the life it still clung to. It tried to help, a feeble shift of its weight, and Lena's throat tightened with a mix of awe and sorrow. "Good dog," she breathed, tears mingling with the rain on her cheeks. "You're so strong." "Ready, Emer?" she said, gripping the sleeves of the jacket. "Pull with me, slowly." Together they tugged, inching the dog toward firmer ground. The mud fought back, releasing its hold with grotesque sucking sounds that echoed in the stillness, a primal resistance that made Lena's arms burn with the strain. Emer's face was set, his small body leaning into the effort, and she marveled at the strength in him, her silent boy, pouring his heart into this rescue. The rain soaked them through, plastering her shirt to her skin, but she barely noticed, her world narrowing to the dog, to Emer, to this moment of fragile hope. After what felt like an eternity, the jacket slid onto solid earth, the dog's body finally free of the bog's grasp. Lena collapsed back, her chest heaving, her hands trembling from cold and exertion. The dog lay still, its breathing ragged but steady, its amber eyes fixed on Emer as he knelt beside it once more. "You did it, buddy," she said, her voice thick with emotion, reaching out to touch his muddy cheek. "You found it. You saved it." His dimples flashed briefly, a flicker of pride, and she felt a sob catch in her throat. They'd pulled it from the mud, but its fight wasn't over, and neither was theirs. In the rain-soaked silence, Lena knew this was more than a rescue. It was a beginning, a bond forged in the mire that would change them forever. The rain had become a merciless drumbeat, hammering the earth as Lena stood over the German shepherd, its frail body now resting on the muddy jacket she'd used to drag it free. The clearing felt like a world apart, isolated by the storm's roar and the dense curtain of trees. But the trailhead and her old station wagon lay somewhere beyond this nightmare. The dog's amber eyes fluttered, its chest rising and falling with a stubborn will that both broke and bolstered Lena's heart. It was alive, yes, but so fragile, its broken leg dangling like a cruel afterthought, its emaciated frame trembling with every breath. They'd freed it from the mud, but freedom meant nothing if it couldn't survive the journey back. Emer knelt beside the dog, his small hands hovering over its matted fur, his mismatched eyes, one blue, one amber, locked on it with a tenderness that made Lena ache. He'd been her rock through this, her silent warrior, and now he looked to her, his face a question she couldn't ignore. "We can't leave it here," she said, her voice raw from the cold and the weight of their task. "We have to get it to the car." But how? The dog was too weak to walk, too heavy for her to carry alone through the slick, treacherous terrain. Her arms still burned from pulling it free, her clothes clung to her like a second skin, and the temperature was dropping fast. She opened her backpack, fumbling with numb fingers to pull out the water bottle. "Let's see if it'll drink," she murmured, pouring a little into her palm and holding it near the dog's muzzle. For a moment it didn't move, and her heart sank. Then its tongue darted out, weak but deliberate, lapping at the water. "Good dog," she whispered, tears stinging her eyes as she offered more, watching it take small, precious sips. It was a lifeline, a flicker of hope, but it wasn't enough. They needed a vet, and they needed it now. Lena emptied her pack, tossing aside snacks and extras until only the essentials remained: keys, phone, a tiny first aid kit. She opened it wide, an idea sparking through the haze of exhaustion. "This might work," she said, glancing at Emer. "We'll use it like a sling." She slid the backpack beneath the dog's hindquarters, where its strength seemed weakest, threading the straps over her shoulders like makeshift handles. "Okay, moment of truth," she breathed, positioning herself behind it. "Emer, stand in front, see if it'll follow you." He moved into place, his small frame steady despite the rain, and made a sound she'd never heard from him before. A soft, clicking noise with his tongue, like a call from some secret language. The dog's head lifted, its ears twitching, and to Lena's amazement, it responded. With a trembling effort, it pushed its front paws under itself, wobbling as she supported its back end with the sling. "That's it," she encouraged, her voice thick with awe. "Try to walk just a little." The dog staggered upright, its broken leg hanging limp, but its other three held just barely. They began to move, a slow, agonizing procession down the trail. Emer walked backward, his clicking steady and sure, his eyes never leaving the dog's. Lena bore its weight, her arms straining, her boots slipping in the mud as the rain lashed them without mercy. The journey stretched into an hour, each step a battle against collapse. The dog stumbled often, nearly falling, but every time it locked eyes with Emer and found the strength to go on. Lena had never seen anything like it. This unspoken bond, this quiet courage between her silent son and a creature on the edge of death. Her muscles screamed, sweat mixed with rainwater on her face, but she pushed forward, driven by the sight of Emer's determination, the dog's resilience. Finally, the trailhead emerged through the trees, her station wagon a beacon in the gravel lot. "We're almost there," she gasped, her voice hoarse with exhaustion. The dog's legs buckled, but it held on, trusting them as they trusted each other. In that rain-soaked moment, Lena felt it, a connection deeper than words, a fragile hope born from the mud, carrying them all toward salvation. The station wagon's tires crunched over the wet gravel as Lena pulled into the lot of Pine Crest Animal Hospital, the rain still drumming a relentless tattoo against the windshield. Her arms ached, her clothes clung to her like a sodden shroud, but all she could feel was the fragile weight of the German shepherd sprawled across the back seat, its ragged breaths a lifeline she clung to. Emer sat beside it, his small hand resting on its muddy fur, his mismatched eyes, one blue, one amber, fixed on the creature with a fierce protectiveness that made her chest ache. They'd fought through the storm to get here, a trio bound by mud and mercy, and now salvation lay just beyond the clinic's faded blue awning. Lena threw the car into park and leapt out, racing to the back to lift the dog. Its body was limp, heavier than its emaciated frame suggested, and she staggered under the strain. "Careful, baby," she warned as Emer climbed out, his boots splashing in puddles, his hand never leaving the dog's side. She pushed through the clinic door, her voice cracking with desperation. "Hello? Anyone here? We need help." The reception area was empty, save for a young woman behind the desk. Marcy, her name tag read, who jumped up, eyes widening at the sight of them. A drenched mother, a silent child, and a half-dead dog barely clinging to life. "Oh my goodness, what happened?" Marcy gasped, rushing around the counter, already reaching for her phone. Lena's words tumbled out in a rush, her voice raw from exhaustion. "We found him in the woods, trapped for days, I think. Barbed wire, mud. He's hurt bad. Please, he needs help right now." Before Marcy could respond, a door at the back burst open and an older man with steel-gray hair and thick glasses strode in, Dr. Cyrus, the town's gruff but skilled veterinarian. His eyes narrowed as he took in the scene, but his voice was calm, commanding. "Bring him back immediately." Together, they guided the dog into an examination room, Lena's arms trembling as they lifted it onto a cold metal table. Its body sagged, its amber eyes half closed, but it was still breathing, still fighting. Dr. Cyrus pulled on latex gloves with practiced efficiency. "You and your boy wait outside," he said firmly. "Marcy will get you towels." Lena hesitated, her heart lurching at the thought of leaving the dog's side. "Will he make it?" she asked, her voice small, almost lost beneath the hum of the clinic's lights. The vet's expression was unreadable, a mask of professionalism. "I'll do what I can." Reluctantly, she took Emer's hand and led him back to the waiting room, her boots leaving muddy smears on the tile. Marcy returned with towels and a tentative smile, offering hot chocolate from the break room. Lena accepted gratefully, wrapping a towel around Emer's shoulders, brushing wet curls from his forehead. He sat unnaturally still, his eyes fixed on the examination room door, as if he could will the dog to live through sheer determination. She dried her own hands, the warmth of the towel a faint comfort against the chill that had settled into her bones, and watched him. This wasn't just a rescue for him. It was something more, something she couldn't yet name. The minutes crawled by, each one an eternity marked by the muffled sounds from beyond the door. Dr. Cyrus's low voice, the clink of instruments, the occasional beep of equipment. Lena's mind raced, replaying the dog's pitiful whine, the way its eyes had met Emer's with a trust that defied its suffering. She'd never seen him connect like this. Not with toys, not with people, not even with her in quite this way. His silence had always been a wall, but now it felt like a bridge, stretching toward this broken creature they'd pulled from the mud. Finally, the door opened and Dr. Cyrus emerged, his scrubs spattered with blood, his face etched with fatigue. Lena stood, her heart in her throat, clutching Emer's hand. "He's alive," the vet said, and she released a breath she hadn't known she was holding, a sob catching in her chest. But barely. Dehydrated, malnourished, hypothermic, broken leg, infected wounds. He's lost a lot of blood. The next 24 hours are critical. Emer tugged at the vet's scrubs, his eyes pleading, and Dr. Cyrus softened. "He'll recover," he added, "if he makes it through the night." In that moment, Lena knew they'd crossed a threshold, into hope, into fear, into a bond that would test them both. The waiting room of Pine Crest Animal Hospital felt like a fragile cocoon, its walls humming with the quiet tension of hope and dread. Lena sat on a faded chair, her damp clothes clinging to her skin, the towel around her shoulders a thin shield against the chill that had settled deep in her bones. Emer perched beside her, his small body rigid, his mismatched eyes, one blue, one amber, fixed on the examination room door with a focus that bordered on reverence. The hot chocolate Marcy had brought sat untouched in his hands, steam curling into the air, a small rebellion against the cold that lingered from their rain-soaked ordeal. Lena watched him, her heart a tangle of love and worry, marveling at the way he'd poured himself into this rescue, her silent son, whose world had always been a locked garden she longed to enter. The minutes stretched thin, each tick of the clock a thread pulling at her nerves. Beyond the door, Dr. Cyrus fought to save the German shepherd they'd pulled from the mud, its frail life hanging in a balance she couldn't see. She replayed the journey in her mind, the dog's pitiful whine, its amber eyes meeting Emer's with a trust that defied its agony, the way her son had knelt beside it, unafraid, as if he'd known it needed him. She'd never seen him like this, so tethered to something outside himself, and it stirred a quiet ache in her chest, a hope she hadn't dared to nurture in years. The door creaked open and Dr. Cyrus stepped out, his face drawn but softer than before. "He's stable for now," he said, peeling off his gloves. "Sedated, on fluids and antibiotics. You can see him, but just for a minute." Lena's breath caught, relief flooding her like a warm tide, and she squeezed Emer's hand. He leapt up, tugging her toward the recovery room with a purpose that made her heart swell. Inside, the dog lay on a padded table, wrapped in warming blankets, an IV line snaking into its front leg. Its broken leg was splinted, its muddy coat cleaned to reveal a black and tan pattern that might have been beautiful once. Emer approached slowly, his small hand hovering over its head, looking to Dr. Cyrus for permission. Gently, the vet nodded, right between the ears. With infinite care, Emer stroked the dog's head, his touch a whisper against its fur. To Lena's astonishment, the sedated animal's tail twitched, a faint, miraculous wag, and her eyes blurred with tears. "He knows you, Doctor," Cyrus said quietly, his voice tinged with wonder. "Dogs are perceptive that way." Lena watched, her breath hitching, as Emer's face softened, his dimples flashing in a rare, fleeting smile. This wasn't just a dog to him, it was a lifeline, a bridge across the silence that had defined his world. "Is there a collar? Any ID?" she asked suddenly, her voice trembling with a new curiosity. Dr. Cyrus shook his head, lifting the blanket around the dog's neck. "Not that I found, but let me check again." He turned the animal's head gently, and something glinted in the harsh light, a thin metal chain nearly hidden in the fur. With a pair of scissors, he cut away a patch of matted hair, revealing a military-style tag embedded in the skin, its edges inflamed. Lena leaned closer, her pulse quickening. The tag was stainless steel, engraved with a name, Rovon, and a cryptic series of letters and numbers, SHPD-XR712. It wasn't a pet tag. It was something else, something official, heavy with secrets. "This is unusual," Dr. Cyrus murmured, frowning as he extracted the tag with careful precision. "Not your standard ID." Lena stared at it, the metal cold and foreign in the sterile room. "Rovon," she read aloud, her voice barely a whisper. At the sound, the dog's ears twitched, a subtle acknowledgement that sent a shiver down her spine. "Well, Rovon's been through hell," the vet said, his tone hardening. "And this tag, it's military grade. Someone marked him for a reason." Emer's hand stilled on the dog's head, his eyes lifting to hers, and Lena felt a chill settle over her. They'd saved a life, but they'd stumbled into a mystery, one that whispered of danger, of a past that wasn't ready to let Rovon go. The recovery room of Pine Crest Animal Hospital was a quiet sanctuary, its sterile walls softened by the hum of machines and the faint rustle of warming blankets cradling Rovon. Lena stood beside the padded table, her heart a tangled knot of relief and wonder as she watched her son, Emer, with the German shepherd they'd pulled from the brink. The dog lay still, its black and tan coat cleaned of mud, its broken legs splinted and its frail body tethered to life by an IV drip. Its amber eyes, though dulled by sedation, followed Emer's every move, a silent testament to the bond that had sparked in the rain-soaked woods. Lena's hands trembled as she brushed a damp curl from her own forehead, the exhaustion of their ordeal mingling with a fragile, blooming hope. Emer sat cross-legged on the floor beside the table, his small face level with Rovon's, his mismatched eyes, one blue as a winter sky, one amber as a dying ember, locked on the dog with an intensity that stole her breath. He'd always been a quiet observer, his world a mystery she'd spent years trying to decipher. But here, with this broken creature, he was different. Alive in a way she'd only dreamed of. Dr. Cyrus lingered near the door, his presence a steady anchor, but it was Emer who held her focus, his small hand resting gently on Rovon's head, tracing the space between its ears with a tenderness that made her chest ache. "He likes you," she said softly, kneeling beside him, her voice thick with emotion. "You're good for him." Emer nodded without looking away, his dimples flashing briefly, and then, without warning, he opened his mouth. A sound emerged, soft and deliberate, not a hum or a grunt, but something more, something intentional. "Van," he murmured, the syllables clumsy but unmistakable. Lena's hand flew to her mouth, a gasp escaping as tears sprang to her eyes. It wasn't perfect. Not yet a word by the world's standards, but it was a sound she'd never heard from him before. A sound that carried a name, a connection, a miracle. In 3 years, despite countless therapies and whispered prayers, Emer had never tried to speak. Not once. Specialists had warned her he might never find his voice, that his silence was a wall too high to climb, and she'd carried that fear like a stone in her heart. But now, here in this quiet room, with a half-dead dog as witness, he'd reached for it. "Rovon," he said again, more confident this time, his eyes lifting to hers, bright with a spark she'd longed to see. The dog responded, its ears perking forward despite the sedation, its tail thumping weakly against the table, a recognition, a reply that sent a shiver through her. "Oh, baby," she whispered, tears spilling down her cheeks as she pulled him into her arms. his small body pressed against hers, warm and real, and she felt the weight of those years of silence, of hope deferred, shift, crack, and begin to crumble. "You said his name. You did it." Dr. Cyrus stepped closer, his gruff exterior softening as he watched. "He knows his name," he observed, his voice tinged with awe. "That's a good sign. His mind's still sharp despite everything." But Lena barely heard him, lost in the sound of her son's voice, a gift she'd almost stopped believing in. She looked at Rovan, the dog who'd endured hell and somehow unlocked this moment, and felt a gratitude so fierce it hurt. Those amber eyes met hers, steady and knowing, as if he understood what he'd done, what he'd given them. Emer pulled back, his gaze returning to the dog, and made the sound again. Rovan, his small hand stroking its fur with a reverence that broke her heart wide open. This wasn't just a rescue anymore. It was an awakening, a bridge across the silence that had separated her from her son since the day he was born. They stayed there, wrapped in the glow of that fragile triumph, as the world outside faded to a murmur. Lena didn't know what lay ahead, the tag's mystery, the dog's survival. But in this moment, with Emer's voice echoing in her ears, she felt a strength she hadn't known she possessed. Rovan had reached him when no one else could, and for that, she'd fight to keep them together, no matter what came next. The quiet hum of Pine Crest Animal Hospital buzzed around Lena like a distant lullaby, but beneath it, a restless unease coiled in her gut. She sat in the recovery room beside Rovan's table, her hand resting lightly on Emer's shoulder as he traced gentle circles on the German shepherd's head. The dog's amber eyes flickered with a weary trust, its breathing steadier now under the care of Dr. Cyrus, yet still fragile, a thread of life stretched thin. Emer's small voice, Rovan, echoed in her mind, a miracle she clung to, replaying its soft, deliberate cadence like a melody she'd waited years to hear. It had lit a fire in her, a fierce joy that warmed the cold corners of her heart. But now, as the day wore on, shadows crept into that light. Dr. Cyrus had stepped out to tend to other patients, leaving them alone with Rovan, and Lena's thoughts drifted to the military tag, the strange steel relic that hinted at a past far darker than a lost pet. She'd slipped it into her pocket, its weight a quiet burden, but its mystery gnawed at her. Who was Rovan before the woods claimed him? Why had he been left to die, tangled in barbed wire and mud? The questions churned, unanswered, until the vet's return broke her reverie. His face was grimmer now, lines etched deeper as he pulled her aside, his voice low. "A man came by this morning after you left. Asked if anyone had brought in a German shepherd." Lena's heart skipped, a cold prickle racing down her spine. "What did you tell him?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, glancing at Emer, who remained oblivious, lost in his quiet communion with Rovan. Dr. Cyrus adjusted his glasses, a flicker of unease in his eyes. "I said patient confidentiality prevented me from discussing any animals in my care. He didn't like that. Flashed some ID, too quick to read, but he had a military bearing. No name, just questions." Lena's fingers tightened around the tag in her pocket, its edges biting into her palm. "Do you think he'll come back?" she pressed, dread pooling in her chest. "Almost certainly," Dr. Cyrus replied, his tone heavy. "Pine Crest is small, people talk. You were seen bringing him in yesterday." The implications hit her like a wave, stealing her breath. Someone was looking for Rovan, someone with authority, resources, and a purpose she couldn't fathom. Her gaze darted to the clinic's front window, where the rain had eased, leaving a gray veil over the parking lot. Was that a dark SUV across the street, its tinted windows glinting faintly? She couldn't be sure, but the sight sent a shiver through her, a mother's instinct screaming that danger was closer than she'd realized. She turned back to Emer, his small form a beacon of innocence beside the dog they'd fought so hard to save. His hand rested on Rovan's neck, his lips moving silently as if whispering secrets only the dog could hear. A sight that would have filled her with wonder hours ago, but now twisted with fear. What had they stumbled into? This wasn't just a rescue anymore. It was a thread unraveling into something vast and shadowed, something that could reach them, touch them, take them. "Be careful, Doctor," Cyrus said quietly, his eyes following hers to the window. "Maybe it's nothing. Maybe he's just an owner looking for a lost dog. But my instincts say otherwise." Lena nodded, her throat tight, and took Emer's hand, feeling the warmth of his small fingers against her chilled skin. "Call me if anything changes with Rovan, or if that man comes back," she said, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her. As they stepped into the waiting room, she pulled Emer close, his trust in her a lifeline amid the uncertainty. The drive home was silent, her eyes flicking to the rearview mirror, searching for that dark SUV, for any sign they were followed. Pine Crest's familiar streets felt foreign now, laced with a threat she couldn't name. Rovan had given Emer his voice, but at what cost? In the quiet of their small house, as she locked the door behind them, Lena knew one truth. Whatever hunted Rovan would find them too, and she'd protect her son, and the dog who'd changed him, with everything she had. The sterile glow of Pine Crest Animal Hospital felt like a fragile shield as night deepened, its quiet hum punctuated by the rhythmic beep of monitors in Rovan's recovery room. Lena sat beside the German Shepherd's table, her fingers tracing the edge of the military tag she'd slipped from her pocket, its cold steel a reminder of the shadows creeping closer. Emer rested against her, his small head nestled under her arm, his mismatched eyes, one blue, one amber, half closed with exhaustion, yet unwilling to leave the dog's side. Rovan lay still, his breathing steadier now, his black and tan coat cleaned and bandaged, but the fragility of his survival hung heavy in the air. Dr. Cyrus had warned her, the next 24 hours would decide everything. The vet had called in Dr. Winters, a younger surgeon with steady hands and a reputation for miracles, to tackle Rovan's broken leg. Lena watched through the glass as they worked, their movements precise under the harsh lights, cutting away dead tissue, setting the shattered bone with pins, stitching the wounds left by barbed wire. Each snip of scissors, each thread of suture was a stitch in the fabric of hope she clung to, a lifeline for the dog who'd unlocked Emer's voice. "He's tough," Dr. Winters had said, emerging hours later, her scrubs sweat-stained, but her eyes bright with cautious optimism. "The leg's stabilized. He's got a fighting chance now, if he wakes up strong." Lena exhaled, a shaky breath of relief, but the victory was short-lived. Dr. Cyrus pulled her aside, his voice low and urgent. "We ran the tag's code through a database, nothing official, just a hunch. It's experimental, Lena. Military Bioengineering, SHPD stands for Shepherd Program Division. Rovan's no ordinary dog, he's a prototype, chipped with something they don't want loose." Her stomach dropped, the room tilting as his words sank in. "What kind of something?" she whispered, clutching the tag tighter. "Data," he replied grimly. "Encrypted, likely dangerous. That man who came by? He's not here to reclaim a pet." Fear clawed at her chest, sharp and cold. Rovan wasn't just a survivor. He was a secret, a living file someone powerful wanted silenced. She glanced at Emer, his small hand resting on Rovan's blanket, and felt a surge of protectiveness so fierce it steadied her trembling hands. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the hum of the clinic. Dr. Cyrus hesitated, then squared his shoulders. "We keep him alive, and we keep him hidden. My cabin's an hour north, off-grid. If they come back, they won't find him here." The decision came fast, born of instinct and desperation. Dr. Winters agreed to stay with Rovan overnight, monitoring his recovery, while Lena and Dr. Cyrus planned the escape. They moved under cover of darkness, the rain a faint drizzle now, masking their steps as they loaded Rovan, still sedated, swaddled in blankets, into the vet's truck. Emer clung to Lena's side, his eyes wide but trusting, his small voice whispering Rovan, like a prayer as they climbed in. The drive was tense, headlights slicing through the black, every shadow a threat. Lena's mind raced. Bioengineering, military secrets, a dog who'd endured hell, and landed on one truth. Rovan had found them for a reason, and she'd fight to keep him safe. They reached the cabin at dawn, a rustic haven tucked among pines, its isolation a fragile armor. Cyrus carried Rovan inside, settling him near a wood stove, while Lena pulled Emer close, his warmth a balm against the fear gnawing at her. "He'll wake up soon," the vet assured, checking the IV line. "And when he does, we'll figure out what's on that chip." Lena nodded, her gaze shifting between her son and the dog, their bond a quiet strength in the storm. They'd escaped, for now, but the weight of what they'd uncovered pressed down, a promise of battles yet to come. In the flicker of the firelight, she vowed to protect them both, no matter the cost. The Pine Crest Animal Hospital stood quiet under a gray dawn, its empty halls a stark contrast to the chaos that had driven Lena, Emer, and Rovan into hiding. Back at the clinic, Dr. Winters had stayed behind, her steady hands and sharp mind a last line of defense as she monitored the German Shepherd's recovery through the night. The surgery had held. Rovan's leg was mending, his vitals creeping toward stability, but the shadow of danger hadn't lifted. Lena's decision to flee with Dr. Cyrus to his cabin had been a desperate gamble, a mother's instinct to shield her son and the dog who'd changed him. Now, as the first light crept through the clinic's windows, that shadow took form. Doctor. Winters was alone in the recovery room, adjusting Rovan's IV when the front door rattled, a sharp, deliberate knock that shattered the stillness. Her pulse quickened, but she steadied herself, wiping her hands on her scrubs as she stepped into the waiting area. Through the glass, she saw him, a tall man in a dark jacket, his posture rigid, military sharp, his face obscured by the brim of a cap. He knocked again, harder, and she opened the door just enough to meet his gaze, cold gray eyes that pinned her like a specimen. "I'm looking for a dog," he said, his voice clipped, authoritative. "German Shepherd, injured. Brought in yesterday." Her stomach twisted, Dr. Cyrus's warning echoing in her mind. She forced a neutral smile, leaning on years of composure. "We get a lot of strays. Can you describe him?" The man's jaw tightened, impatience flickering as he pulled a photo from his pocket. Rovan, unmistakably, though healthier, prouder, a stark contrast to the broken creature she'd stitched back together. "This one's mine," he said, stepping closer. "Where is he?" Dr. Winters held her ground, her heart pounding. "I can't discuss patients without proof of ownership. Clinic policy." He didn't flinch, producing a badge, too quick to read, but official enough to chill her blood. "This is bigger than your policy," he snapped, pushing past her into the clinic. Panic surged, but she followed, her voice rising. "You can't just—" Before she could finish, a crash came from the recovery room, the sound of a chair toppling as Rovan, groggy but awake, struggled to his feet. The man's head whipped toward the noise, and Dr. Winters lunged to block him, but he shoved her aside, his boots thudding against the tile. Inside, Rovan stood trembling, his splinted leg wobbling, his amber eyes wide with fear and defiance. Emer wasn't there, safe with Lena at the cabin, but the man didn't know that. "There you are," he growled, reaching for a device on his belt, something sleek and metallic that gleamed with menace. Dr. Winters shouted, "Stop!" But it was too late. Rovan bared his teeth, a low growl rumbling from his chest, a sound of raw instinct, of a creature pushed beyond endurance. Then, from the corner of the room where Lena had left Emer's jacket, a small voice pierced the air. "No!" It was Emer's cry, recorded on a whim by Lena the night before. A desperate plea she'd captured when he'd first spoken, played now by a phone left behind. The sound froze the man, his hand hovering over the device, and in that split second, Rovan lunged. Weak as he was, his jaws snapped at the man's leg, forcing a yelp of pain and a stumble backward. Winters seized the moment, grabbing a metal tray and swinging it hard against his arm. The device clattered to the floor, and the man cursed, retreating as Rovan growled again, his strength fading but his spirit unbroken. "Tell them he's gone," the man snarled, clutching his arm as he backed toward the door. "Tell them you lost him, or they'll come for you too." Then he was gone, the SUV's engine roaring to life outside as he fled into the dawn. Dr. Winters sank against the wall, her breath ragged, her eyes on Rovan as he collapsed back onto the table, panting but alive. The phone looped Emer's "no," a tiny, fierce echo of the boy who'd saved this dog as much as it had saved him. She scooped it up, silencing it, and dialed Lena with shaking hands. "They came," she whispered when the line connected. "He's safe, for now, but they're not done." The cabin, nestled deep in the pines, stood like a sentinel against the dawn, its wooden walls bathed in the soft, golden light that broke through the storm's last whispers. Inside, the air smelled of wood smoke and pine sap, a fragile warmth that wrapped around Lena as she sat by the stove, her arms encircling Emer. His small body pressed against hers, his mismatched eyes, one blue, one amber, fixed on Rovan, who lay on a quilt near the fire. The German shepherd's breathing was steady now, his splinted leg outstretched, his black and tan coat catching the flicker of flames. Dr. Cyrus knelt beside him, adjusting a makeshift bandage, his face etched with the weariness of a man who'd seen too much in one night. The phone call from Dr. Winters had come like a thunderclap. Rovan safe, the intruder gone. But the threat lingered, a shadow they couldn't outrun. Lena's fingers brushed the military tag on the table, its cold steel a stark reminder of the secrets it held. Dr. Cyrus had cracked it open with tools from his shed, revealing a tiny chip embedded within, a digital vault of encrypted data, its purpose as mysterious as it was menacing. "This is what they're after," he said, his voice low, holding the chip to the light. "Evidence, maybe. Experiments gone wrong, things they don't want the world to know." Lena's heart pounded, her mind racing back to the man at the clinic, his cold eyes and the device he'd wielded. Rovan wasn't just a dog, he was a witness, a survivor carrying proof of a cruelty they'd only begun to understand. Emer shifted in her lap, his small hand reaching for Rovan, and whispered, "Rovan." The word, his second after no, was a soft, deliberate gift, a thread of sound that wove them tighter together. The dog's ears twitched, his amber eyes lifting to meet Emer's, and Lena felt tears prick her own. This bond, forged in mud and rain, had given her son a voice when nothing else could, and now it had drawn them into a fight she hadn't chosen. "They'll come for him," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. "They won't stop until they have this." She tapped the chip, its weight a burden she couldn't shake. Dr. Cyrus nodded, his jaw tight. "Then we don't let them have it, or him. We go public." The idea struck her like a spark, dangerous but alive with possibility. "Upload it," he continued, pulling a laptop from a dusty shelf. "Every file, every byte. Let the world see what they did. They can't silence everyone." Lena hesitated, fear warring with hope. Exposure could save them, or doom them faster. But as she looked at Emer, at the dog who'd fought to live, she knew hiding wasn't enough. They'd saved Rovan from the mud. Now they'd save him from the shadows. Together, they worked, the cabin a quiet hive of determination. Dr. Cyrus decrypted the chip's contents, blurred images of labs, documents stamped with redacted warnings, audio logs of commands and cries. It painted a grim picture. Rovan, engineered for strength and obedience, discarded when the experiment failed, left to die with secrets locked inside him. Lena's hands shook as she uploaded it all to a dozen anonymous sites, her breath hitching with every click. "If this gets out," she whispered, "they'll have no reason to chase us." Dr. Cyrus squeezed her shoulder, a rare softness in his eyes. "And if it doesn't, we'll keep running." The upload finished as the sun climbed higher, its light spilling through the windows. Rovan stirred, lifting his head with a strength he hadn't shown before, and Emer slid to the floor, wrapping his arms around the dog's neck. "Rove on," he said again, clearer now, and the dog's tail thumped against the quilt. A quiet triumph. Lena watched them, her heart swelling with a love so fierce it drowned her fear. They'd exposed the truth, scattered it to the winds, and now they'd build a life, here or wherever safety took them, together. Outside, the pines stood tall, whispering of resilience, and Lena knew this wasn't an ending, but a beginning. Roven had found them in the mud, given Emer his voice, and pulled them into a fight worth winning. Whatever came next, they'd face it as a family, unbreakable, unshaken, bound by a bond no shadow could sever. In the quiet of that cabin, Lena, Emer, and Roven found more than survival. They found a bond that speaks to the heart of us all. Their story is a testament to resilience, to the power of love in the face of darkness, a reminder that even the smallest voices can change everything. If their journey touched you, if it stirred your soul, join us on this channel for more tales of courage and inspiration. Subscribe now, and let's walk together through stories that lift us up, proving that hope can bloom even in the deepest mud.